Good evening and welcome to this discussion hosted by Hub Affairs and sponsored by Huawei. Today we are going to be discussing global multilateral governance and the next generation of European leaders that tomorrow needs. It's obviously a very timely discussion. We are at a turning point, we hope, in the pandemic, but it's certainly changed all our lives, including we'll have a couple of video interventions and a bit of discussion with our speakers whom I will introduce in due course. But as you can see, underneath the screen there's a link to Slido. You can use that, or you can go on your phones to slido, sli.do, or slido.com. Use the hashtag multilateralism and please type in your questions there so we can see what you want to ask or what's interesting you about what our speakers are saying. If your question is to a particular speaker, please address them, put that in the question, and try and keep the questions concise. I'll be trying to follow along on my phone to see what you're saying, as well as our back team of tech experts. With that, I will give the tech experts the heads up, as we are now going to hear our first video message, and that is from Fabio Massimo Castaldo, the Vice President of the European Parliament, on the subject of multilateralism, globalization, and global governance.
Hello everyone, it is my pleasure to participate in this event on behalf of Brussels New Generation, the BNG, a network of over 700 young professionals in Brussels. Brussels being Brussels, our members are from many different EU and non-EU nationalities, diverse backgrounds, and are working in very diverse organizations. So it is quite a representative group of young generations across Europe. And I will share some reflections of what I think are the expectations of this diverse group towards multilateral governance. And my starting point for these reflections is the feeling that is probably shared by many millennials that we grew up with a sense of we are reaching the end of history. And in the last half decade or so, we realized that this is not the case anymore. For example, progression of globalization, technological progress, and actions addressing climate change used to be governed at global level in multilateral fora, and the overall sense was that it was working fine or at least good enough, and this is really not the case anymore. And more dramatically, the direction of progress or even the need for progress is being questioned, and not only by activist groups, that was already the case in the 20th century, but also by global elites, including heads of state and presidents of major economies. So my first expectation would be to discuss in this event what the overall long-term goals or long-term challenges should be that multilateral governance needs to address. And climate action here jumps to mind as an example. It might be easy to refer to the Paris Agreement to find the answer to the question of what the global targets should be, but that's also a case in point. Can the superpowers really agree on that? And what about the governance of digital transformation? Here it becomes even murkier. What are the long-term goals we strive for with digital transformation? It seems that the world stumbled into a situation where digital threatens first order values of democracy, trust in science, and the rule of law. So Brussels is a very special place to discuss some of these questions. My hunch is that many of the young professionals who flock to Brussels have at least the expectation of somehow benefiting from globalization and multilateral institutions. For example, professionally speaking, working in fields related to the EU. But it would be too easy to state as a second expectation, please hand over the multilateral institution intact from one generation to the next generation of maybe a global elite that has international education and wants to have international careers. Instead, the second expectation I would like to put to the discussion here is more inclusive. And the question would be, how can multilateral governance communicate more effectively not only to the global elite and the future global elite, but also the disenchanted who are driving the backlash against multilateral governance and multilateral institution that we have seen in the last few years. So those would be my two questions or my two expectations that I hope can be discussed here in this event. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. As we can see, that was not actually Fabio Massimo Castaldo. That was, in fact, we have there Julian Jakobitz from the Brussels New Generation of Young Leaders. But he has also set out the frame of discussion for us this evening. And we are now going to go to Mr. Castaldo.
Dear colleagues and honorable guests, I'm really delighted to be opening this interesting debate today together with you on the European prospects regarding multilateral governance after the coronavirus pandemic. In recent years, social, political, and economic uncertainty has given rise to a new age of populism and nationalism worldwide, which is causing the constant erosion of multilateralism and the return to a clear geopolitics of power. The causes behind this crisis are complex and deep at the same time, in part the product of a global phenomenon of rising nationalism across the globe and the country-first politics and approach, as well as the result of unilateral actions taken by great powers like China, Russia, and the United States, and also regional powers as well as Turkey, for example. The outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic could have served as an opportunity for these leaders to rediscover the value of international cooperation in fighting this global disease. However, quite the opposite happened. Many countries reacted by reinforcing their unilateral instincts, closing borders, cutting funds to international organizations, or seizing and restricting trade in medical equipment. Also within the EU, the initial uncoordinated response by member states raised questions about the competence of the European political establishment. However, the EU was able to agree on a recovery initiative matching the historical task, taking unprecedented decisions to do everything necessary to remain united, competitive, and rooted in solidarity. Many now argue that multilateralism has been weakened to such an extent that all we can do is maintain the status quo, fall back on the defense of basic principles. I urge you not to lose hope and not to lose sight of the bigger picture, nor commitment. Throughout history, it has often been the case that steps forward have been followed by steps back, only for events to then move ahead again, perhaps even faster than before. A clear example of this is that drawing lessons from this emergency, which exposed major flaws in the US health systems, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen highlighted the need to build a stronger European health union in her first State of the Union address, and relaunched the idea of rethinking health competence, which is currently in the hands of member states. To conclude, yes, the challenges are definitely daunting, but the opportunities are unprecedented, and tools at our disposal more effective than ever before. Multilateralism is the only safe way to forge ahead towards a world order based on international law and universal norms, and the EU, which has always made multilateral diplomacy its main weapon, needs to be at the forefront of the process of inverting this trend. With these feelings, I would like to give you the warmest welcome to all the colleagues and the speakers that will contribute today to the debate, with the auspice for an interesting and very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you there to our two video interventions. We've heard some different viewpoints and different sides. We have now, as I say, got four great expert speakers here to discuss this topic. So let me introduce Professor Andrea Renda, who is Head of Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation and the Digital Economy at SEPS. Andy Purdy, who is the Chief Security Officer of Huawei USA. We have Maria Soraya Rodriguez Ramos, MEP from the European Parliament, obviously, and Chair of the Delegation for Relations with the Pan-African Parliament, and Henry Llewellyn, who is the ad interim Chair of the Brussels New Generation of Young Leaders. Andrea, let me start with you. We heard there Mr. Castaldo saying that the opportunities were unprecedented. Do you agree with that, or how do you react to those two interventions?
Thank you, Jennifer. I think it's good that we heard two interventions together because I think they offered slightly different angles and perspectives. In Julian's perspective, I think what really struck me is his reference to a sort of a past situation in which multilateralism was applied, and sort of a identification of this suffering of state of play to get back to. So for me, I think we need to go back a few months and reflect on what was happening before the pandemic. Otherwise, we run the risk of thinking that we have to improve something that we will go on the right track and unfortunately and unpredictable, by the way, predictable, but unpredictable to really ruin all our plans. Indeed, if you go back, say, 9 months, you are in a position in which still some of the problems that had emerged already with the financial crisis and the subsequent economic crisis a decade ago had not been fully solved. The inability of countries to really converge on the protection of the environment was really clear. The multilateralism was already deeply in crisis, and the so-called global goods that should be the real subject for multilateral cooperation were in a relatively gloomy state in terms of our ability to pursue them. So indeed, I think we have to differentiate the short-term problems that we will have and will continue to have, let's say, in the medium term because of the pandemic and all the things that it has uncovered, the problems that have been exacerbated, but also a number of problems that existed already since the period before the pandemic that we need to fix at the same time. And I would like to mention a few that, in my opinion, are at the root of our current inability to solve even the new problems. One of them is not necessarily only environmental unsustainability, but it's also social unsustainability. Academic research from various sides has identified a number of trends, such as the increase in market concentration in a number of sectors, the increase of profits, the polarization of markets, the increase of inequality, the deterioration of social cohesion that has come with a number of models of capitalism that we have seen emerging over time. I'm, for example, talking about the platform economy, among others. We haven't been able to really fix those problems before the pandemic. Today, we face a situation in which we have existing economic models, if you wish, economic and political models, none of which are really a good example of a path that we could be following in the future. We don't have obvious examples of, let's say, success stories. We've had the United States during the pandemic showing the fragility of their economy, with workers going, the people on unemployment subsidies going from 300,000 to 30 million in 3 weeks, just to show how fragile and weak is the level of economic security that the United States model gives to workers. We obviously have China on the other side, exploiting the pandemic also to double down on mass surveillance and also to capitalize on its ability to organize in the economy thanks to the absence of democratic constraints by really extending its control not only in its own territory, but also developing things such as the mass diplomacy that are really sort of a newcomer in an already relatively difficult world. So I think in all this, what we discover, and it's echoed also by Fabio Massimo in his speech, is that Europe, first of all, has to do the homework properly in-house, show that it is able to organize, orchestrate the different positions of the member states, to then offer and project into the global community a better example. I don't think we have fully succeeded there, although I think that many good things have been done. My concern is that one of the key solutions that have been found so far, the Next Generation EU agreement, is a solution that tries to make all the member states happy, but maybe the EU level a little bit weaker. So I'm curious to know what Soraya will think about that, because the Parliament is having a key role in trying to restore at least the original magnitude of the EU commitment towards efforts. I'm also a little bit concerned, and then I'll hand over to you, Jennifer, so that you can give the floor to the other speakers. I'm also a little bit concerned that the EU so far has not fully demonstrated the strength and the commitment needed to move convincingly ahead towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
We'll get into that in due course. Let me turn now over to Andy. Andrea there said multilateralism was in crisis before the pandemic, and we can't hang all our ills and all our woes on the one thing. Do you agree? Do you not agree? What is your reaction to Andrea and also to our interventions beforehand?
Well, I think from time to time the ugly head, if you will, of the geopolitics of power raises its head, and that's usually under the surface as well, but now we see more of that coming forward. Multilateralism is very, very important. I might even call it collaboration. It doesn't necessarily have to be decision-making, but there needs to be a really strong collaboration about what is necessary and what can be done about it. Those who participate in the multilateral discussions, whether it's a group of member states, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the United States and its like-minded countries, folks benefit from that. We as a global community, we need to do more to not give up. So, for example, in the pandemic, there's discussion about whether member states should make the decisions about healthcare. The fact is, there was inadequate preparation for the possibility of a pandemic almost anywhere in the world. So whether it's formal decision-making or not, folks need to collaborate and figure out public-private partnership, what needs to happen. And now we need to make sure that we can improve on what happened, even though it's still going on. We need to make sure that there are facts that are shared, that we call out if somebody doesn't state the facts, that we call for the development of evidence. I just saw a statement by the head of the World Health Organization saying that major lockdowns don't work. But there needs to be a strategy for how we respond to these things, and there needs to be lessons learned. You take cyberspace. There have been 20 years of cyber norms of conduct, and now China has come out with a global initiative on data security, where there are a couple of, I think, new things, some things they may have disagreed with before. The global community needs to say it's not just enough that we talk about these things. We need to drive substantial progress. We need to move toward norms that matter. We need to get countries and companies to sign on to these norms. We need to try to get consequences if they violate. We need to improve the effort at attribution, including technical attribution. And it can't be up to governments. It needs to be up to independent organizations that will tell the truth about who's behind cyber attacks, who's behind thefts of intellectual property. These kinds of things are very, very important. And multilateralism also takes the form of collaboration on standards and best practices. Those who participate, like common criteria, or the 5G standards, or the NESAs, Network Equipment Security Assurance Standards. Those who participate and use these will benefit. We want to encourage the rest of the world to do the same thing. But the global community needs to drain the swamp of malicious activity in cyberspace. Needs to step up and fight malware and spam and close down botnets and fight those who are allowing malicious activity to be protected within certain countries. This we need to do together, and we need to step up even though it's difficult.
Thank you, Andy. Soraya, let me turn to you and ask you, in your opinion, to what extent has the coronavirus put the spotlight on the necessity for better cooperation and governance within a multilateral framework?
Thank you. I think it is a good time to bring the debate on multilateralism to the table, because COVID-19 has shown us that in face of global challenges, unilateral response is simply not possible. In our plunge into COVID-19 pandemic, we have witnessed interlocking dynamics that work between nationalism and a necessary concerted response. Health, therefore, means the health of all. At an individual personal level, the pandemic has been something of a turning point, a blow that has forced us to stop and focus on what is important, health and the importance of caring for those around us. In Spain, in Europe, throughout the world, we have observed an unprecedented battle against a terrible virus that has taken the lives of many citizens. The losses that our societies have had to face are irreplaceable. But how many more could there have been? How many more could there be in the future without concerted action, without global governance, without international solidarity? The battle against COVID-19 is a tangible reality that reminds us of three essential lessons. First, multilateralism is an end in itself. And second, multilateralism must be a tool to deliver tangible results in improving people's lives. And thirdly, as COVID-19 has spread around the world, there has been increasing emphasis on how humankind interferes with nature and how this interaction creates conditions for spread of new zoonotic diseases. Xi'an shows us how biodiversity loss and ecosystem change can increase the risk of disease spread among humans, animals, and other species. Unhealthy and balanced environment and prosperous ecosystems are the best protection against possible zoonotic pandemics. Protecting biodiversity is our best vaccine for the future. The defense of multilateralism in this context is also to make our societies understand that without joint action, without solidarity, life is a struggle against the law of the strongest. The pandemic and its asymmetrical effects have shown the fragility of an interdependent
terms of the effect of the coronavirus, I think it's really, as in many areas of the economy and our lives, has stress tested our strengths and weaknesses. And I think it's brought out, in some ways, the best and the worst of both ourselves, but also actors at the international and national levels. And I think that there is a great potential going forwards, which I feel, so I mentioned Sarah talked about the pandemic being a turning point. And in many regards, I fear that the real turning point is yet to happen. And that turning point will occur when the real economic effects of the pandemic make themselves felt, which is most likely to happen over the next 12 to 18 months. Because at the moment, we're still in a bit of a state of limbo, and furlough schemes are now contracting. And we already have a world in which there is a feeling, at least in the Western world, that there is an intergenerational conflict. That is to say that the previous generation, or the generation that's currently in power, has not left the planet in as good a position as it might be for the generation to come, be it in the environment, also pensions, housing, how the global finance system is structured. And so going forwards, with an even worse economic system exacerbated by this coronavirus pandemic, I greatly fear that that will exacerbate some intergenerational struggle. And finally, though, on a more optimistic note, I would say it has shone a spotlight on the ingenuity of the human race, its ability to act within a framework which, at least in part, is dependent on a framework built by multilateral endeavours. So when I look at how the world economy has resolved supply chain issues because of coronavirus and kept food and drink on our tables, when I look at the coordination of medical knowledge, where there's at least in part occurred between nations, I think it shows that whilst there are significant weaknesses that have been exacerbated, there's also a huge repository of potential, one might argue, because of digital transformations, unparalleled in history. So I don't believe it doom and gloom entirely. I think there is a lot that can be done going forward.
Okay, that's a good point to jump off of. But I'm going to come back to something that Andy mentioned. I've got a lot of questions coming in via Slido. Now, Andy, you mentioned that independent organizations, international organizations, should be called upon to tell the truth, and perhaps that they are, rather than national governments, for the sort of leadership we should be looking to. So we have a question here, which is from Anonymous. Which reforms should the United Nations undergo in order to make it fit for the future? But I'll tie it together with a couple of other questions. Antonia Villafranca says that the G20 is the most important multilateral forum, and what are the expectations for the Italian presidency in the G20 in 2021? And then I'll also add in another question. Should a new international body or a whole new dedicated branch of an existing one be created after the COVID crisis to develop a common global strategy? So all those three questions, focusing on G20, the UN, NATO, or the possibility of a brand new organization. Where do you feel that the responsibility lies, Andy, within what you were saying earlier?
Well, I understand the appeal of the question and coming up with an answer to, this is the organization that we need. I think the challenge of coming up with that may not be worth the fight right now. We need to make some progress. And if it's a coalition of independent groups, some folks I know, former Netherlands cyber ambassador Timo Koster was working with some folks on attribution for cyber attacks, technical attribution for cyber attacks. Folks have to make progress on those things. Communities of interest coming together, like the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace in the Paris Call. Folks come together to start making progress and trying to figure out what works. It's something under control of the UN. The United States isn't going to like that. The G20, maybe China's not going to like that. But making sure we can get to the point where there's better attribution available and use resources in cyberspace such as the network operators, the internet service providers. They can see the bots, they can see the malware. We have to hold them to a higher standard.
Andrea, you're nodding and shaking your head at some of those comments.
Yeah, my impression is that I don't want to be, let's say, more pessimistic. Henry, I think, gave us some beacons of hope there. My impression is that the state of global collaboration currently, I would describe it as the web of bilateral relations and the shadow under the umbrella of the overarching rivalry between the US and China. So most of the things that could be done through a global agreement cannot be done because of this obsession, indeed, that leads the two biggest superpowers to really fight on every front, everywhere. So from the virus to cyberspace. So what Andy was saying obviously has an appeal, but also the obvious limit of his own company, for example, being banned almost globally because of the overall effect of the Clean Network Initiative and the sanctions, as an effect of unilateral initiatives by the United States. The field I've been mostly active lately, which is that of artificial intelligence, is a field in which a global cooperation on responsible uses of artificial intelligence technology is almost impossible because even the OECD, even the G20 is now tainted because there's either an external endorsement or participation of Russia and China in the meetings. So there is an attempt, mostly from the US side, to create a smaller cohort of countries considered to be like-minded, and on the other side, there are attempts to sort of drag the European Union towards, let's say, more agreement towards the East. It's interesting because every day I'm invited to conferences on global cooperation, and when I'm invited to conferences on global cooperation from the US side, it's typically the world minus Russia and China. And when I'm invited to global conferences on conferences of global cooperation from China, it's typically the world minus the US. So I think that is a little bit of a problem. in a situation in which we have to do at least a major reflection on how our economic model should change going forward, and how much protectionism we can afford in a situation in which most countries preach three major things that they can probably achieve with different levels of completeness, which are protecting, later preparing the economy, maybe for future risks, and ultimately transforming the economies in a way that makes them more sustainable. And this protect, prepare, transform paradigm is something that, in my opinion, is the way forward, but it's extremely difficult under current conditions.
Well, lucky enough for us, Andrea, we're not in the East or in the US, we're in Europe, so we are going to be able to discuss everything. I think perhaps a little bit harsh to say that Norway is banned almost everywhere. I'm going to let Andy respond to that, actually, as I come
I can elaborate on it.
Yeah, we're actually banned in very, very few countries of the world. It's interesting, a former national security official about the U.S. government's Clean Network Initiative. He said it is not about security. The Clean Initiative does not follow the U.S. government's own strategy for 5G security or the Department of Defense strategy. It is not unbiased, it's not rational, it's not objective, it's discriminatory, protectionist, and a non-tariff barrier to free and fair international trade. The fact is, ban Huawei if you must. But let's make cyberspace a whole lot safer, because 5 nations in the world have the ability to virtually implant hidden functionality without permission. So we as a global community, as we become more dependent on 5G, we have to protect ourselves, and we have to do it in an objective and transparent way.
Okay, well, we're going to move on from that particular topic. Henry, I'm going to bring you back in. I'm going to stay on this question of international non-state actor organizations. Do you think the UN has lost trust over the recent months of the COVID pandemic, and how long will it take for things to return to some sort of equilibrium? The WTO, the supporters of the world, saying they don't trust because of the pandemic. We are in what is often said to be a pandemic of disinformation as well. Where do you think we're going, and do you think there is an erosion of trust in international organizations that is detrimental to multilateralism?
Well, in many ways, I would go back to what was said previously, whereby the pandemic itself is not just the major turning point, and the fact that it has exacerbated some of the issues. But I think there was a significant erosion of trust in the UN far before this point. And I think, in terms of how non-state actors will succeed going forwards, I really liked that expression of a bilateral web rather than multilateral. And I can see a world in which the most important thing, probably to ensure a spread of values or norms, will just be a complete effort to ensure as much transparency as possible. I'll give a small example in a field which I'm specialised in. The European Commission right now, with DG Comp, is by far and away the most influential competition authority in the world. And the reason for that is not because DG Comp are cleverer than their US counterparts or their Chinese counterparts. The reason for that is that they have to publish all of their decisions in exhaustive detail when it comes to matters of controversy. And in the US, it doesn't happen. It only happens in litigation first. So for me, and this is sort of building on Andy's point about needing to ensure safeguards, we will only succeed going forwards in multilateralism with mass transparency and land see as much as possible. Without that, you will not work, because there will always be a perception, at least, of a hidden agenda.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Soraya now and ask from an EU point of view. What are the priorities for the EU to foster multilateralism at the UN level? What role should the EU play at the UN level, and what sort of influence can the EU bring to bear? You're on mute.
Thanks. It's not easy to talk about priorities in a war, in crisis, but in any case, priorities are about human rights, after all, which are the basis of multilateralism. The world has changed, but the multilateralism plays the same role. I think there are a new problems, but we have the old problems we can to resolve. For instance, climate change was not considered major concern in the past. However, the Eurobarometer shows how 23% of the EU citizens consider climate change as the second most serious problem at the global level. The right to healthy environment is also a human right. Climate change now is a defining crisis in our time. Nevertheless, the first most serious problem facing the world, according to EU citizens, is poverty, hunger, and lack of drinking water. 27% EU citizens think this. Now, 821 million people wake up hungry every morning all over the world. Hunger is the invisible pandemic. And hunger is not a problem of production, but a problem of respect and protection of human rights. And the most important thing is that hunger at a global level is avoidable. Many health, economy, and social priorities will emerge in the upcoming months, but we must be able to make our societies and governments understand that multilateralism is a priority that cannot be postponed. And European Union is a strong, reliable partner of the United Nations. I believe that we are living through a historic moment, and that this crisis has shown us that it is time for change. I listen to young people, and it is impossible to avoid this responsibility. Finally, I want to say last week during the plenary session, we approved the climate law in the European Parliament. On that day, we saw that this Parliament is aligned with science. And very important, was an important moment, an historical moment, and we reconcile ourselves with our children to solve that responsibilities that defines against climate change, and the commitment to multilateralism are solved from concrete steps and actions to can improve the lives of our citizens and the future of the new generation. Now is the time, and this is the path on which we must continue from the European Union, making ambitious goals for a sustainable future.
Thank you, Soraya. And you mentioned climate change. We're going to come on and talk about that a little bit next, because we've got many questions coming in via Slido. And just a reminder to our audience, if you do want to ask questions directly to our panelists, use the link below that says Slido and use the hashtag multilateralism, and I'll keep an eye on your questions. Now, several people raised the issue of climate change and the green agenda. Indeed, someone mentioned that China's new 2050 climate goals pledge might be significant. But one of our interesting questions is that the approach of green recovery often does not fit the plans of lately or more recently industrialized countries. I mean, what incentives do they need from the international community? Andrea, can I let you answer that one first?
Well, what incentives do they need? It's going to be extremely difficult for the international community to provide incentive to individual governments at this stage. Also because the say, commitment to sustainability is easier to formulate in times of relative prosperity compared to times of emergency, right? And while it is easy in words to say we aim at sustainability, in practice this is going to be very complicated. And I want to broaden a little bit the picture, because if you move, one thing most people conflate, let's say, the environmental goals with the sustainability work. Sustainability has different dimensions. It's not just environmental sustainability. It's also social sustainability. It's also economic sustainability, and it's also a matter of governance, protection of human rights, strength of institutions, good governance. Henry was referring to that to some extent when he was talking about DG Comp, right? Transparency, accountability of institutions. And I think the trade-offs that we have today are extremely important. It's going to be, at least in the medium term, difficult to focus on the environmental goals without compromising on other goals. And in my opinion, we need a strategy that is really based on a coherent set of actions. Currently in Europe, when we craft our policies and we implement them, we don't measure progress. Still, we don't measure progress based on the Sustainable Development Goals. We still use GDP as a North Star. Now the European semester is trying to introduce a little bit an observation of national reforms based on the SDGs. But if you look at individual policies at the European level and in the member states, there's a lack of coherence. We still have lots of fossil fuel subsidies in a lot of the member states. We have a lot of countries implementing reforms that exacerbate inequality. We have a lot of external actions of the European Union which do not justice to the objective of creating prosperity and making the EU a champion of prosperity. So the first thing that I would say, let's do the homework. Let's fix what we can do at home to make the EU a granitic example of sustainability at all levels, including, of course, the climate and the environment. And then I think let's forge new alliances, because the EU would not be able to rely, for example, on transatlantic cooperation for climate change for the foreseeable time. And we would need to establish a trust relationship with China in order to really drive collaboration and mutual alignment on the environmental goals. So I would say, if I were a European Union leader today, I would rather look at what the EU can bring in places like Latin America, in places like Africa, in order to really bring an example of creating value locally, creating prosperity, relying on good governance, and together move towards a very balanced, harmonious model of development.
Well, Henry, if you were a European leader of the future, what would be your take on it?
I think actually, building on what Andrea was saying, I do think one of the opportunities for Europe lies in this breakdown of multilateralism, with the US at the moment certainly being less predictable than it certainly was 4 or 5 years ago, and China increasingly assertive, because then that means that many powers outside of Europe, which would not necessarily have seen Europe as the first port of call, actually will feel and are demonstrating at this day and this time that Europe is actually the place they want to come for more certainty and security. And there is an opportunity there for Europe to leverage its very significant expertise, its significant soft and economic power to, as Andrea was talking about, to develop these norms and to develop technologies of the future. And I certainly think that for me as a European leader in 20, 30 years, I would hope that I would be building on what the current generation in Europe could be doing at this day right now. And it certainly is allowing norms of transparency, but also using Europe's soft power to spread that to other parts of the world, which may be afraid of tying themselves too closely to either China or the US.
Andy, do you think the EU is afraid to be attached too much to China or the US?
Well, I think the idea of trying to collaborate globally, trying to collaborate within the EU and within the individual countries about what the potential benefits are and what the potential risks are. So I think most of the countries feel that despite the pressure from the United States, they can make decisions based on facts, based on evidence. And regarding the climate change point, I think it's very important as a complement to what was being said, is that 5G can have tremendous benefits in terms of making an impact on climate change, reducing the carbon footprint of the base stations, for example, very significantly the ability to improve the efficiency of the manufacturing process, which is going to save a tremendous amount of energy, and that's going to save an awful lot of money. So I hope that as part of the effort to move forward, the EU generally, or perhaps individual member states, will form incubation centers where they have companies, private sector, experts, and government come together to talk about what's necessary and what's possible.
Okay, well, I'm seeing a lot of activity on our Slido that's sort of in reaction to what you've been saying about climate change, which is, again, coming on to this question of humanitarian aid to developing nations. One asks, how did the corona crisis affect the global dynamics of humanitarian aid and development assistance? Another asks, which role do debt relief measures play for developing countries for the global recovery from the coronavirus? This is obviously something that has stimulated a lot of interest. Andrea, do you want to give me your take on that? Soraya, perhaps I'll come to you as well afterwards.
Well, obviously, the future of humanitarian aid depends very much on how tight the budgets and the individual countries will be, and also I think the level of coordination, in particular on the European side, that we'll be able to express. One thing is to give the direct aid, and I think the External Action Service in particular has been quite active at EU level in coordinating immediate aid to not only the European citizens that were in trouble around the world when the pandemic emerged, but also to the countries that are where poverty is exploding. But that the issue there will not. I mean, some countries will actually suffer also because of the shortening or the interruption of the global value chains that would leave some countries completely excluded from the global economy. And this, I think that will be very difficult to tackle in the years to come. To me, I mean, if I read the data that were released by the IMF today, and also a few weeks ago, there was an update today on poverty post-COVID-19, and also echoing what Soraya was saying. At the global level, we are basically going back to the 90s. One of the things that we had seen in terms of inroads, progress that we had made, at least. So I don't think this is something that can be solved by even a single superpower alone, and it will be solved by one of the superpowers in the lead. The risk is that the investment that will be made in developing countries to try and lift people out of poverty will come with strings attached, and this is something that requires chiefly multilateral cooperation. There has to be a global agreement that developing countries and least developed countries are not enslaved to the economic interests of one single superpower that has more liquidity than others, just because the time is a time of emergency. It is here that if you look at, let's say, for example, the global investment side of things, you have there another important battle going on between the Silk and Belt Road and the Digital Silk Road on the one hand, and the possible standards that are offered to developing countries as a full package by Western powers. I think there's another danger of fragmentation of the global community, of ephemeral help to least developed countries, and overall to a sort of a land and economy grabbing game that will only be detrimental to developing countries. So this is a global good example. It is about prosperity in all zip codes of the planet, and this is not something that can be solved by the initiative of one country alone. If there is a bloc that can try to foster and as Henry was saying before, maybe interpret this role, this is certainly the European Union. But I fear that the European Union alone will not be able, unless it establishes very deep relationship with countries that indeed share past history, legal traditions, and a lot of ties, social and economic ties with Europe. If Europe is not able to deepen those relationships, those countries will have, in my opinion, very little hope to come back to restore their prosperity and sustainability in the medium term.
Soraya, let me turn to you. Has the COVID crisis changed the nature or the focus of humanitarian aid to developing countries?
Excuse me. Yes, I've seen a little, but it's a bit to risk this situation. But I've seen in this moment and with serious consequences of COVID-19 in humanitarian situation. The humanitarian system in United Nations is very, very important and is key. The recent Nobel Prize to World Food Program is a good example. But the humanitarian system of United Nations needs support of the international community. And in the last year, the trend has reversed. In the last year, the United Nations has reduced the support to important humanitarian organizations like the UNRWA. I think for the future in the next months with serious consequences of COVID-19 pandemic, we need to reinforce the humanitarian system of United Nations because it's very, very important to assist them and to coordinate of work in the different countries in important sector like, for example, food and the other important problems have economic consequences. Thank you.
Well, Andy, I presume you would say that it's not just up to governments, it has to be public-private partnerships, particularly with a view to connectivity.
Well, there are 3 billion people in the world who lack connectivity, and the benefits that are going to flow from 5G connectivity are going to make their lives a whole lot better, and it's going to help stir innovation and employment. And so the G20, the UN, the OAS groups have to call on private companies to collaborate to implement a strategy to bring connectivity to the rest of the world. This is very, very important.
Okay, Henry, I'm going to sort of just come to you and ask you to sort of respond. There's been a lot of discussion since I last called on you. How are you reacting to what you're hearing from the other 3 speakers?
I think that it's always this tension between I think most people know what the problems are, and I think really the issue is actually the direction we take to resolve those problems. And whilst I think there is broad frameworks in place, and if in a perfect world we could have the necessary interaction between the different actors, there's no obvious reason why we couldn't get to a place that would be fine. My concern is I don't necessarily see how we can put that all together and what the incentives are for the different actors that would be required to come together in order to reach those outcomes. And that's where I detected an element of dissonance. I think it's good that we have, for example, Andy's talking about how 5G technology will help, and certainly when we look at how the world is transforming, and technology has played an incredible role. I even feel old these days when TikTok, for example, has come along, and I don't. TikTok is sort of the generation after me. So we live in a world where pace is very, very quick, but also pace is dangerous in some ways because digital technology is enriching increasingly small numbers of people, certainly from a monetary perspective, but then creating tension between other people who are losing their jobs because of digitalization. So it's still a mess, and I don't think I've quite heard the outcomes. But having said that, that's no reflection on the speakers because I think these are very complex issues.
I mean, I may be wrong, but I don't think TikTok's going to save the world. But that said, we do need the space of a commons, and a digital commons where we can all speak and share opinions, which I know is a point that you've all made. There have been a lot of the inevitable questions that you could probably have guessed, which is what will be the immediate impact of the US election on the UN, but also on other aspects of the world. There's quite several questions on that. So I'm going to ask each of you in turn reflect on it. Soraya, what would you like to make a prediction of the US election? I know that's a huge question.
It's a good question. But I think the European Union must work with United States and with different governments. But I think it's very important the United States want to work together inside of the United Nations system. Because the most important thing of multilateral system is every country role an important play, independent of economy situation, economy development, and it's for the reason United European Union will work in the future with all countries, but United States is an important and strong country inside of the multilateral system, national system. I hope in the future we can find a strong relation to work together. Thank you.
Thank you for the very diplomatic answer. Andy, let me turn that question to you. Reflections, predictions, concerns?
Well, in past years, I would have said that the fact that the election was November 3rd would mean the results would be on November 3rd. I literally just got an email while we're in this webinar from my county telling me that they received my ballot, so that's good. I think there will probably be greater predictability in the conduct of the U.S. After the election. I hope that the toxic political environment that pervades the United States can somehow be improved, but I'm not optimistic. The news channels are all Trump all the time. They're probably the reason he got elected in the first place. But I have a feeling that hostile environment is going to carry on. But I hope, touching on some of the issues that Andrea talked about, that I hope we can look at evidence-based decision-making, and that people who disagree can listen to the evidence and find what available evidence there is or there needs to be, so that we can make decisions based on facts and evidence, so it increases the chance that the policy decisions will have the intended result. Other than that, I'm not too good at making a prediction.
Well, you and me both. I think if we knew that, we'd all have money on it. Henry, have you a crystal ball? And if you don't, give us your thoughts on what might be the impact of the US election on the EU and the EU relations and attempts to foster multilateralism in the world at large.
Yeah, well, having been fairly scarred by the Brexit referendum and the last US election, I think predictions are not the easiest. I mean, I think we all know what the polls are pointing towards, but obviously polls have been wrong in previous years. I mean, for me, I think that there is a bit of a fork in the road here, which will really matter for the US, because right now, the way the US institutions are structured, in many ways, they are allowing, and this is a slight generalization here, but I think it's true, an older generation which is to a degree in the minority, to impose their views on a majority and predominantly younger generation in the US. And those are primarily, the primary functions of that are the Senate and the Supreme Court, and the presidency through the Electoral College has done, I think all of those three are basically pointing the way to that. Now, the question is, does that stop to a degree of this election, or will it stop further down the line at a subsequent election? Because that is the direction of travel. And I hope, for the sake of the US, and not from a political perspective, but purely because intergenerational conflict is always bad, that is resolved sooner rather than later. Because the longer you keep it there and the longer splits exist, the harder it will be to put everything back together.
Andrea, your thoughts as well. I think it was Soraya that earlier in our discussion said that we need to get away from the law of the strongest. Trump is not the only sort of strong man, if you like, leader in the world at the moment, but he does dominate the headlines, particularly at the moment.
Yeah, they are becoming more and more numerous around the world. Indeed, it seems like a style of power that is gaining new affiliates as we move on. Here, a little bit, I disagree a little bit with Henry, meaning that my impression, Henry, has been shocked by the Brexit happenings, and so I wouldn't equate the situation in the UK where there was really an intergenerational clash to some extent, and also somehow a geographic one as well, with the US, which, in my opinion, is an extremely divided society. Also, in all ages. And it's a divided society, and I've happened to live in the United States during the past election, so I've been extremely surprised myself, even during the evening of the elections and seeing how things went. But indeed, the experience of living in the United States, the recent experiences, and I know what Andy thinks about that, but gave me the impression that this is a country that is on the verge of social collapse, meaning that whoever wins the elections, the United States is doomed to remain an extremely divided society in the coming years. So whoever wins will have enormous constraints. You know that in the literature on international relations, in the academic literature on negotiations in particular, there's normally this idea that countries, when they operate externally, they always are fighting two battles, if you wish, or negotiating on two tables. One is internal, with internal constituencies that put pressure on a country, and the other one is external, that of course depends on what other countries allow and what is the context of a negotiation. Well, in this case, I think that I'm not very optimistic on the United States going back to a leading role and a champion role in multilateralism anytime soon. And I want to go back a little bit also to what was said and also what Andy was saying before, because obviously some of the listeners might have been struck a little bit by the emphasis on connectivity and our discussion on hunger, right? So it might seem, not want to go against Andy, but it might seem that there's a lot of people in the world that are looking and waiting for food, and then you go there and bring 5G. Now the issue here is that we need to make sure that we restore a way of doing humanitarian aid that is sustainable, which means we need to bring food, and over time we have to put the preconditions and create the preconditions for development. Whoever is there, whoever agrees, whether the United States is there or not, but I think the preconditions for development include certainly connectivity, include skills, include education, include good governance at the local level, include the ability of whoever goes and brings aid to create value and development where they go, in the place where they go. So connectivity is one of those ingredients. I agree with Andy. But I think, obviously, from the Huawei perspective, this is what they mostly bring. But governments need to make sure that, together with connectivity, developing countries have all the ingredients of the recipe for development. And this, I think, is an enormous responsibility, even more post-COVID. We need to make sure that whatever is done in humanitarian aid is done with this spirit rather than purely rainmaking and then leaving the territory.
Okay, well, we've just got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to put a final kind of overarching question to all of you, which, taking into account what Andrea said, we're looking at a food crisis, we're looking at issues of connectivity, we're looking at sustainability, climate change, as well as governance, and the governance of all those elements. If the US and China do not agree, this is one of the questions in this debate, is it up to the EU to become a bridge for a safe and prosperous future? Does that happen? Should that happen? Is the onus on the EU to do that, or does the EU need to look to its own? Going to ask Henry that question first, and I'll come to each of you.
Yeah, I think that sort of touches on what I referenced before about the fact that we do have a split between the US and China now, and how Andrea saying you go to different conferences and depending on who's sponsoring them, we have 12 years in there. So the clear lead or the clear opportunity for Europe is to be that bridge. I think the question is really, because I think inevitably Europe is and will continue to be that. It's how Europe uses that opportunity. Does it use it in an inward-looking fashion, so merely creating norms and values and expecting them to be spread just through soft power, which the EU is already very effective at in many regards? Or does it seek to become more interventionist overseas? My feeling, particularly in these very difficult economic times going forwards, that there is certainly an increased tension on funds. There is a lack of political will in terms of cohesive collective action. And I think a safer or the safest path for the EU is to concentrate on what it does best, which I think is that projection of soft powers and the establishment of norms, particularly look at GDPR, which is very controversial, but nonetheless has been massively adopted outside of the EU, even in places like the US, major corporates. That for me is the surest path for Europe to continue to be viewed as not only a great actor internationally, but one that's not necessarily overstepping the mark and making itself look foolish going forward.
Thank you. Well, we won't go down a GDPR rabbit hole at this late stage in the discussion. Andy, do you agree? Do you think it's an optimistic outlook for the EU, or will it get squashed between the US and China, especially post-corona?
I'm certainly optimistic about the ability of the EU to be a major leader. And I think the effort, for example, for the EU to develop a technology industrial strategy to help advance what interests in the EU make the most sense, and to lead in terms of building on, and we see it now with the European Commission, we see it with Germany, some of the work in the UK, creating international standards for 5G, international standards for telecom equipment, with independent conformance, independent testing. Also for GDPR, when you look at WeChat and TikTok, Europe, respectfully, needs to build on the GDPR and come up with requirements for protecting data. Right now, companies are afraid that they're going to get hit with up to 4% of their gross revenues for violations, but there need to be requirements for, if you're going to keep the data in the EU, how do you protect the data from the apps? How do you make sure it's not being improperly accessed? How do you make sure it's not being sent to China or the US or anywhere else? I think Europe can play a major role and generally in making for a safer cyberspace, because I think the world will listen to Europe.
Thank you for that, Andy. I know we could have a long conversation about that on another day. Soraya, what is your perspective? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the role of Europe in bridging the gap between the US and China?
The European Union is the European Union and has our role and has its own role. And of course, mediation or better cooperation among countries is important. But the European Union is no one's savor and multilateralism. It's not to try to get the gap, but to work all together. I think the European Union play our role, and it's not an free mediation between China and the United States.
Thank you, Andrea. Your thoughts?
Well, first thought is the greater the cohesion, the internal cohesion of the EU, the greater the possibility for the EU to project such cohesion externally. And we don't know what the level of cohesion of the EU will be going forward. COVID-19 will put it to the test, I would say. Also, next generation EU will put it to the test. There's economists, political scientists already making scenarios, some of which are more fragmentation, more federalist approaches, a European health union, at least something that would at least give some power to the EU to act on that area, which was perhaps the most, let's say, the weakest in the whole construct of the EU, of the European Union. That said, I think the EU alone will not be able to play that role. In the absence of the United States and China, or with battling the United States and China, the EU can do this as a leader, but it needs Canada, it needs Australia, it needs Japan, it needs India in the future It needs African countries that will become even more and more, let's say, populated, and it needs Latin American countries. It needs all the others, and it needs obviously also the United Kingdom in order to achieve this. And if the EU will be able to orchestrate both the private sector and this public sector players in a way that helps them to converge towards something that is ultimately a win-win, for most of those players. Because when you start from the law of the jungle and you want to move back to a more orderly place, the only ones that really have to lose are the ones that in the law of the jungle prosper. And in this case, we're trying to transition to a more harmonious and orderly world. So obviously the EU, if it wants to do it, it needs to partner with all the ones that are currently not profiting from the current situation, or not battling for what I consider to be a crazy leadership type of prize. So that is, for me, the battle. Internal cohesion, ability to forge alliances with the unusual suspects, and finally, a very good way to act. Some people have called it the Sinatra Doctrine. My way, Josep Borrell replied, maybe I'll choose the Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin Doctrine, which is Je t'aime moi non plus. But whatever it is with the relationship with the other countries, Europe is now in a position of having to play initially solo, but later together with many other countries. Like people normally say, and there's an old saying that I like to quote from every now and then: if you want to go fast, go alone, right? If you're going to go far, go together.
That is a nice quote. I'm glad you wrapped up on that. I'm looking through the slide of comments. We've had a lot of questions on topics we didn't manage to get to. You touched on Brexit, as I know you did, Henry, as well. We didn't really get into that because sometimes it can derail conversations. We also didn't perhaps talk an awful lot about Russia, which we could have done. I was getting a note about that. But I feel like we've touched on many of the main points that sort of dominate the headlines. There is no denying that the coronavirus has shaken the EU to its core. Solutions like Next Generation EU or proposals like that, we will see how well they fit in with the international community and things like the UN sustainability goals, UN sustainable development goals. I think there's an awful lot still to talk about. And with that, I'm going to remind everyone watching at home or in their offices or wherever they may be to continue this conversation on social media. Use the hashtag multilateralism, and we will encourage our speakers to join in that conversation with you as well. Thank you very much to all our speakers, to Andrea, to Soraya, to Andy, and to Henry, and also to Huawei for sponsoring the event, and to Public Affairs. And I will note that Public Affairs are also holding an event tomorrow, again at 6 p.m. Brussels time, on how the EU can foster a zero-emission mobility system across Europe. So if you're interested in the climate change aspect of our discussion, perhaps you should tune into that. And with that, I wish everyone a good evening.